Good morning and welcome to Kunsang Payo Chuling. Today's teaching by Jetsunma Ahkon Lhamo is entitled How to Generate Meritorious Activity. It was given in 1990 and was very helpful at that time, and I'm just guessing it's going to be very helpful now. So hope you enjoy it. We'll begin now.
In most spiritual traditions, whether they are Buddhist or non-Buddhist, whether they are Christian or Muslim, each religion has an idea of what particular kinds of activities would be beneficial. Each religion has an idea of what would be virtuous. Each religion has an idea of what would bring us closer to the goal, whatever we see the goal as being. Every religion that I know of personally, and I can't say that this is true of all religions because I know that there are some religions that have only a few members on this earth, but the major religions that I know about have an idea of kindness or compassionate activity as being a cornerstone for that religion. So the idea of engaging in virtuous activity or engaging in compassionate activity should really not be a new one for any of us. This should be an idea that each one of us, if we are seeking spiritual teaching, has come to be a cornerstone. It's come to be an idea that we all accept. In whatever particular form we accept it. How we approach that idea, however, depends on the teaching that we've had within the context of our particular religion. The Buddha has a specific way of approaching the idea of virtuous activity and compassionate activity. The Buddha does not teach us that we are, for instance, chalking up points and that eventually those points will get us into heaven. That isn't a Buddhist idea. That's not how we think. According to the Buddha's teachings, all sentient beings are experiencing suffering. That cyclic existence, that is, the cycle of death and rebirth, that we all are engaged in again and again and again, according to the Buddha, is pervaded with suffering, is filled with suffering. And even though many of us might feel, even at this very moment, happy, and might say that generally speaking our lives are pretty happy and that we are pretty happy people, we have experienced suffering. We have. Each one of us has. And we will all experience the broad suffering, the broad human suffering that all humans experience, which is the suffering of old age, sickness, and death. Each one of us will experience at least 2 out of 3. If we don't live to be old, we will be sick and we will die. Something like that will happen. So, since this is a condition that we are all dealing with, the Buddha has given teachings on this condition and has tried to indicate the meaning of the condition, the reason of the condition, and the cessation or the end of the condition. The antidote, if you will, of the condition. According to the Buddha, We are all suffering, and we suffer apparently, for instance, as a human, from old age, sickness, and death. But that the real cause of suffering, if we really trace back all of the cause and effect relationships that brought about this human condition, the real cause of suffering actually is ego clinging and desire, which occurs due to that ego clinging. According to the Buddha, we have no real sense of our true nature. We can theorize about it, we can fabricate an experience about it, we can think that we've been taught about it, we can make one up. But as we are involved in cyclic existence, and as we are sentient beings believing heartily in our individuality, due to that fixation on individuality, we have not had a real sense of our own primordial wisdom nature. We can only guess what that nature is. We can only hear teachings about that nature and try to understand. We can only develop snatches or scent, perhaps a moment's scent of what that nature must be like. Yet to have a real sense of that primordial wisdom nature, to abide spontaneously in that primordial wisdom nature, one's mind has to be extremely spacious. One has to be not fixed, and we are fixed, you see, on that sense of self-nature. One has to be not fixed on individuality, but one's mind has to be spontaneous, spacious, aware of its own natural luminosity, without fixating on specific condition. As sentient beings, we are not in the position to experience that reality, but instead we are fixed on the process of individuality, fixed on the perception of self-nature as being inherently real, and therefore fixed on the habitual tendencies that come from that fixation. The Buddha teaches us that even our five senses, with which we might even try in our meditation to experience this nature, are in fact deluded, that they are merely extensions of the ego, and that they perceive according to relativity. And the example that I like to give, which I think is a good indication and a way to help us understand, is, for instance, if I experience this glass, this glass of cold water, how do I experience it? I experience it as cold because I'm warm. Relative to me, I experience it as cold. If I were a lizard or a fish that lived in the deep sea, I might not experience this water as cold. If I experience it as wet, I experience it as wet because I'm dry. But if I were, again, a fish in the ocean, I would not experience the wetness of this. I experience it as hard because my skin is soft and flexible. But if I were some life form that were very bony and encased in a shell, I might not experience this as hard. I experience this as small relative to me because I can easily pick it up. Even my daughter, who is very small, can pick it up. But if I were an ant or a very small insect, I wouldn't experience this as small at all. I would experience it as impossibly big. So the five senses are actually, in that way, an extension of self, or the perception of self-nature. They are an extension of the ego. And these are the senses upon which we rely in order to even hear the Buddha's teaching. When I talk of the luminous nature, for instance, according to the teachings of the Buddhas, we can only understand luminosity according to what we have seen with our own eyes. These are the means by which we achieve cognition. And so it is a relative cognition. Well, according to the Buddha's teachings, however, our true nature, our primordial wisdom nature, is not like that and is not even within that realm of experience. It is completely free of such contrivance as relativity. It is completely free of conceptualization. It is completely free of the limitation of even time and space, in that it spontaneously arises and is immediately self-liberated. These are the teachings that we receive about that nature that we have never experienced. And what we are also taught is that not experiencing that nature, instead we are revolving continually and endlessly in cyclic existence. And that revolution occurs due to our clinging through this habit pattern of relative perception. We are constantly clinging to the belief in self-nature as being inherently real, and we are constantly clinging to the exaggeration and elaboration that occurs due to that experience. That the Buddha calls desire. And we are constantly involved in desire. We desire to establish and reaffirm ourselves constantly, to reconstruct our ego at every moment. Once we establish the idea of ego, we must constantly construct it, or ego does not exist. If we are not constantly constructing it, the entire idea falls apart. But we do constantly construct it, and we do with a very strong sense of habitual pattern and clinging. And the Buddha teaches us that this clinging, this desire, this habitual tendency to fixate on self-nature as being inherently real is the real cause of suffering. It is that causes us to achieve rebirth again and again and again. It is that clinging that causes us to conceptualize self-nature again and again and again, appearing in cyclic existence, achieving rebirth continually. And, as you know, if you achieve rebirth, you've also automatically achieved death. Because one is not born without dying. Birth always leads to death. Meeting always leads to separation. All things in cyclic existence are changeable and impermanent, according to the Buddha's teaching. So it is, therefore, that ego clinging that causes us to revolve in suffering. Most of us have suffered due to losing a loved one. We've either lost a marriage, or some of us have tragically lost a child, or some of us have tragically lost a loved one, a parent. If not, you will. And that's because coming together always results in going apart. There are no exceptions. So even our happiness of coming together and experiencing the joy of that is tinged and tainted, if you will, with the eventuality of separation. All of this, according to the Buddha's teaching, is due to the belief in self-nature as being inherently real, which is the birth mother of our experience in cyclic existence. It is that desire that causes us to return and again and again and again in this form, or in some form. In our tradition, in the Buddhist teaching, and particularly in the Vajrayana tradition, we engage in practices that the Buddha teaches us are antidotes to this desire, antidotes to this revolution in cyclic existence, antidotes to ego clinging, antidotes to fixation. There are, in the Vajrayana tradition, many different kinds of practices that one can do. One can do very simple preliminary practice, one can do more involved intermediate practice, and one can do the most exquisite and extraordinary completion practice, or very advanced practices. And even within each of those categories, there are literally hundreds and sometimes thousands of different practices that one can do. One kind of practice that is very useful and very common in the Vajrayana teaching is to generate oneself as a primordial wisdom deity, as a Buddha or Bodhisattva. And in generating oneself as a primordial wisdom deity, one actually applies, therefore, the antidote to what we are doing now, which is to generate oneself as an ordinary individual person. That is what we're doing, you know. You're here, and you're doing that now, or you wouldn't be here. According to the Buddha's teaching, what causes you to arise as an ordinary individual person is desire. Desire is at the heart of that experience. And every experience that we have after that initial concept of desire, that initial idea of self-nature as being inherently real and the clinging to that idea and the elaboration of that idea, every experience that we have from that moment on is a result of that initial impulse. So we then apply the antidote. And the antidote is to generate ourselves as the primordial wisdom nature being, or deity rather, the Buddha or Bodhisattva that we are generating ourselves as. And there are many that we can use in that regard. The difference is that when one generates oneself as the deity, one goes through an event or a practice of naturally arising as the deity. And that is to say, first one meditates on shunyata. And what that actually means is that one meditates on the spaciousness and emptiness. One meditates on the primordial empty nature. One lets go of all conceptualization and rests the mind in the experience of emptiness. And then from that, which you might have noticed you don't do as a human being, one then arises with almost like a wind of compassion. There is a breath of compassion, so that the first movement from that primordial empty state is not one of desire. The first concept is not one of ego clinging. It is like a breath of compassion. The first thought, the first impulse, the first movement from emptiness is compassion. So immediately one meditates upon compassion and considers that all things are a result of this compassion, and then one generates oneself as the deity by generating first the seed syllable, which is an indication of the pure mind state of the deity, and then one generates oneself as the deity, which is the pure form. But that deity form arises from emptiness and from the first movement from emptiness, which is compassion. Arises from that state, rather than arising from ego clinging, which is how we got born. Rather than rising from impure karma, which is how we are having the very experience that we're having now. Instead, one arises in this pure way. And one becomes skilled at that to the degree that one can not only accomplish that very well and very solidly in one's practice. Maybe solidly is a bad word. One should visualize the deity as being insubstantial, like a rainbow. But in a very firm way, one can learn to practice. But one can also learn to practice in such a way that one generates oneself as the deity and actually considers that the first movement within one's mind, the first concept or experience, is compassion. One can begin to constantly be mindful of that experience. That is the antidote to the very kinds of sufferings that we are experiencing now, and the very kinds of sufferings that the Buddha has taught us that we are having. That is an applied antidote, and it works very well. I would never take an antidote if I didn't know that it worked. I would never take medicine that I didn't know was proven to cure the disease. I know that this antidote works because I know that the lamas in the lineage that I practice have achieved extraordinary results. I myself have seen relics, precious objects that are left to us by lamas who have achieved realization. And it is not possible to leave such relics if one had not achieved realization. So I know that within our tradition there has already been success. I think about my root gurus and I look at them and I know that there is success. So that being the case, I feel that I can apply the antidote. When we are engaged in such practice, we have to be very careful that we are true to ourselves. Because if we are simply involved in the idea that in all religions there is some, say, compassionate activity that we can do or some virtuous activity that we can do that will get us some good result, we should then challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, are we simply acting the part, or are we deeply and earnestly trying to get the ultimate result? And what do I mean by that? In my life, I tend to know people that are involved in religion. I know all of you, and all of you are Dharma practitioners, or many of you are Dharma practitioners. Those of you that are not Dharma practitioners are people that are interested in spirituality. And even my friends, people that I know, people that I'm acquainted with, generally approach me and I approach them due to something having to do with religion. So I know that people involved in religion engage in practices that are virtuous, or engage in some kind of activity that are virtuous, and engage in compassion. But I also have seen many people involved in religion that use that inappropriately. And I think that we should be truthful and really listen carefully to what we are seeing, learn from it. Because I have seen people that know that according to their religion it is good to be kind. And so they act kind. But acting kind and practicing true generosity to the depth of one's heart, these are two different things. Acting kind in a superficial way will cause you to look kind. Generating oneself as a pure form and constantly engaging in those activities which will benefit others, this is true generosity. One will produce a superficial result. One will produce enlightenment. I have seen people who are involved in religion acting very virtuous. They will compose their faces and their features in a virtuous manner. Haven't you seen it in spiritual circles? Haven't you seen a virtuous manner? Haven't you seen a pious face? What good does it do? Perhaps you yourself have composed your features in a pious and virtuous face. That kind of superficiality is very different from the kind of depth that one can engage in when one actually accomplishes meditation, contemplation, visualization, recitation, prayer, generosity, and offering. And does so with such fervent regard that devotion and purity spontaneously arise from the depth of one's heart. That will produce the optimum result. That will produce the end of suffering and will produce great happiness, and that will produce enlightenment. But merely to act virtuous or to compose oneself in a virtuous manner, that will produce no good result, as it actually causes us to engage in further ego clinging. But I've seen it, and I see it all the time. Unfortunately, I even see it with those people that are practicing Dharma. As a teacher, I try to help them get over that. But the best one to help us get over that is our own selves. If we can be courageous and true to ourselves and responsible for the experience that is going on within our own mind streams, for the experience that is going on within our own hearts, we can be our own best friend in that way. Similarly, I see people talking the spiritual talk and walking the spiritual walk and being in all the right places, being seen doing all the right things. But I have also seen people that practice to the depth of their heart, that examine their minds and really review what their thoughts are, that have taken a vow and they will no longer allow hatred to coexist with pure intention in their minds. That is to say, they have taken a vow of pure intention and they will not allow hatred to be within their minds. They insist and require from themselves. They insist on and require from themselves diligence in their practice. They review themselves for hatred and try to purge it from their minds. They check to see if they are really practicing generosity and kindness, and are they doing it to the depth of their heart? Is it changing them? They monitor themselves for their ability to experience devotion. And knowing that they are not perfect at this moment, they continually make a stronger and stronger effort. This kind of practice I have named spiritual fidelity. I feel that a person who really practices to the depth of their heart in that way will have good result because they are being true to the ultimate object of refuge, to the true goal, which is their own primordial wisdom nature, which is inseparable from the Buddha nature. If they are practicing that kind of spiritual fidelity, they will have good result. If, on the other hand, they are merely going through the motions in their practice, with no regard to depth, with no regard to the courage that it takes to really view oneself honestly and practice deeply, they will not have good result. And the activity that they are engaged in reminds me of the sound that one hears over a very cheap and tinny small transistor radio. It's just not the same music. We each of us have a choice. We can practice on an instrument that is high fidelity. We can practice on an instrument that is true, an instrument that is real. And the sound will be similar to the goal and will produce the goal. Or we can practice on that tinny little transistor radio. That instrument is your pure intention. That instrument is your effort. And how that instrument works for you is exactly in accordance with what you do and how you hold yourself as you walk down the spiritual path. So whether you are a long-term practitioner or whether you are what I would call a lifer, whether you are just beginning to practice Dharma, whether you've never heard of Dharma before and you just came here to see what this is all about, you can use these teachings. You can adopt this philosophy because you can be true to yourself. You can engage in virtuous activity. I encourage you to examine for yourself the Buddhist teaching. I encourage you to examine whether or not the results are worthwhile and whether or not this path has produced those results. And I encourage you to practice the path if you find that the answer to these questions are yes. The Buddha himself said that one should examine the path thoroughly and should determine for oneself whether or not the result is worthy and the path leads to the result. You should do that. Having adopted the path, however, the moment that one has adopted the path, one should open one's heart completely and practice with extraordinary devotion and to the depth of one's heart. So the parting words that I have for you are words that I say every single Sunday, and if you come every Sunday you'll hear them again and again and probably get horribly bored with them, but I'll say them again. If you have come here and have heard teaching and you use the teaching, if you incorporate it into your practice, and if you incorporate it into your daily life, whether you are Buddhist or not Buddhist, you have spent your time wisely, because it will benefit you and it will bring you some good result. But if you've come here and you're not going to use any of this, if you're going to let it roll off of you like water off a duck's back, or if you're going to just think that it was nice to be here and that you were entertained in some way, then you've wasted your time and you've wasted mine. So think about that and please practice accordingly.
Thank you very much for joining with us today, and hope you come back next Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time in the U.S. I know we often have people joining us from around the world, and it's got to be really weird to watch all of this in the middle of the night, but I'm so glad you do. And we hope you come to KPC if you're in the area, and enjoy the activities here. The temple is open every day, holidays every day, from dawn to dusk outside and from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. inside. And the activities that we have in the prayer room, all the practices and that sort of thing, are on a calendar on our website, which is tara.org. And you can find the calendar just by scrolling down the home page to the bottom. And there's a link to webcasts and calendar. And when you click on there, you can find, whatever's happening. If there's a puja, if there's anything. And you can check in there. Click on the event and it will give you where it's being, what online location it's happening, if it's happening live as well. And also, if you need any codes to get in, it will give you those there. It also gives you a link to the practice that we are doing so that you can join in fully. We hope you do. It's always great to see folks that we haven't met yet in person, but obviously we've met you somewhere. And so, because you found us. Let's see. All of that's available to you. The next thing up on our calendar is Khenpo Tenzin Karze, our resident Khenpo, who is absolutely delightful to listen to. And in just about an hour at 11:30 our time, and it's now 10:35, he will give a meditation talk about various kinds of meditation, various focuses you can have in your meditation. And right now he's working on the four immeasurables and how you can meditate on them and deepen your practice. Then he does a short meditation and answers questions. So if you're online, we share it on Zoom, Facebook, and I think Instagram. So if you're online, you can put your question in the chats, and we'll read it out to him and you can get answers to your questions. And you can also just join in what is often a really interesting time. Often the best questions come toward the end, or at the end, because he'll close, and then we sort of serve some tea or some water and something. And during the more relaxed time is when people seem to be able to ask questions better. So if you stick around, you can sometimes hear answers to more unusual questions. Anyway, we'd enjoy having you there for that. Later this afternoon, we will be doing a Riggs and Dupa soak practice, and that is at 2 p.m. 2 p.m. or 4 p.m.? Oh, my Lord. 4. It's at 4 p.m. And I don't know if it's inside or outside. It depends on the weather. Weather's been pretty changeable these days. So, but it will be on Zoom for sure. And again, you can go to the calendar and get that link. So, thanks for joining, and hope to see you anytime in person. Love to meet you all. And thank you. Thank you for just being here and being interested in compassion. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. See you next time.